The desert didn't forgive weakness. By noon, the sun beat down like judgment itself, turning every breath into grit, every heartbeat into thunder. Clara reined in her horse at the edge of a dry gulch, her eyes narrowing against the blaze. At first, she thought it was just another coyote carcass scattered in the dust. But then it moved. A man, bare-chested, bleeding, half dead, dragged himself through the sand like he had no right to be alive. The law said she should ride on. A woman alone out here had no business stopping for strangers, least of all one marked in war paint and blood. One choice, and her life might be over. But something in her chest refused the command to turn away. She dismounted, slowly, cautiously. The air was so quiet she could hear the flies buzzing over his wounds, hear her own pulse drumming in her ears. She could even hear the faint rattle of the revolver at her hip, ready but not yet drawn. And right here, before the story unfolds, friend, if you're listening, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. These campfire tales of love and survival only keep burning because folks like you ride with us every week. Now, let's keep on. Clara crouched low. The stranger's lips were cracked, muttering in a tongue she did not know. His hand trembled near a knife strapped to his belt, though he was far too weak to lift it. His eyes, black as obsidian, met hers with a fire that should have already burned out. In that instant, Clara understood. If she left him, he would die. If she stayed, she might follow him to the grave. Dust swirled around them, the land itself holding its breath. Clara reached for her canteen. The outpost auction smelled of sweat, pine tar, and shame. Men bartered for axes, mules, and iron tools. But Mabel stood among them as if she were less than the rusted chains on the table, her wrists bound with rope, her chin forced down by a hand that was supposed to have raised her in love. Her parents, worn thin by hunger and bitterness, had set her here as though she were no more than cracked pottery. Barren, they whispered, like it was a curse that made her unfit for womanhood, unfit for worth. And yet, when the bidding began, only one man lifted grieving, watched her with wide eyes from the doorway. Their mother gone to fever years before, their father carved into stone by loneliness. Mabel set her bundle on the floor and knew this was no rescue. It was trial by fire. Every corner of the cabin breathed rejection. Her womb called empty, her worth weighed against seed and soil. But in the quiet, when she patched worn trousers with shaking fingers or stirred a pot with hands unused to plenty, the children began to circle closer. A boy placed a pine cone in her lap as if it were treasure. A girl reached for her hand in the dark, and Silas, rough-hewn and near voiceless after years of chopping alone in the timber, found himself watching her as though she were a light he'd thought forever extinguished. It was not quick love, it was not easy. Winter pressed them hard, and neighbors whispered that a woman like her could never give him a legacy. But love, like timber, is shaped not in the swing of an axe but in the slow burn of fire. When the river froze, she kept them warm. When drought cracked the earth, she kept them fed. And when Silas, one night by lamplight, carved his grief into cedar planks, Mabel stood beside him, unashamed of the emptiness she carried. For she had filled the cabin with something else. Seasons turned, scars softened, and what began as survival ripened into devotion. In the end, Silas carved a gatepost with words no one in town could dispute. "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." And beneath the pines, where axes sang and children grew, their love stood taller than any tree, a testament that family is not bound by womb or blood, but by the fierce will to belong. The year was 1869. And the Oregon Territory was a place that devoured the lonely. Silas Boone knew this well. Each winter cut deeper, each summer stretched drier. And though his hands were thick as oak knots from swinging an axe, his heart had become hollow timber echoing with loss. He stood among a ragged crowd at the outpost auction where voices barked bids for cattle, axes, wagons, and mules. Then, in the corner, a figure no one wanted stood still as a shadow. A woman, her wrists bound. Remove it. In the cabin, lit only by firelight, she finally spoke, her voice cracked but steady. "Do you not wish to see what you've bought?" Silas shook his head. "I don't reckon it matters. You're here, and I don't plan to treat you less than human." For days she moved about the cabin veiled in sackcloth, stirring stew, mending shirts, stacking kindling with quiet grace. The children of loneliness pressed hard on Silas, but her presence, though shrouded, softened the edges of his silence. Then, one night when the snow fell hard against the windows, she pulled the sack away. Scars marred her face, pale lines running like rivers across skin that had once been unbroken. But her eyes, clear, storm-bright, met his, and Silas's heart stuttered like an axe striking stone. Recognition struck. He had seen those eyes before. Years earlier, half frozen and lost in a blizzard, he had stumbled into death's embrace, only to be dragged back by a stranger with a lantern. She had pulled him from the snow, covered him with her own cloak, and vanished before dawn. He had never known her name, until now. "Annabelle Crow," she whispered, voice trembling like a hymn. "I saved you once, but I was not spared. Men came after, men who carved their cruelty into me and left me for nothing. That sack, it has been my veil, my prison." Silas reached across the table, rough hand covering hers. "Then let it be your veil no longer." From that moment, her sackcloth became more than shame. It became a symbol transformed. Where others saw disgrace, Silas saw resurrection. He carved her name into the cabin beams, built her a chair at the table, gave her back the dignity the world had tried to strip away. In time, the sack itself was kept, not as a mark of humiliation, but as a relic of survival. When the day of their wedding came, simple and quiet beneath the cathedral of pines, Annabelle lifted that sack once more, not as a mask, but as a veil. The sun poured through branches like stained glass, turning her scars to silver. Silas, in his worn coat and steady eyes, vowed not to erase her past, but to walk with her land, weather-beaten, enduring, yet half-starved of hope. It was at a roadside auction outside a saloon under the pitiless sun that his life bent into a shape he could not have imagined. She was brought forward barefoot, her wrists bound, her eyes downcast. The auctioneer barked, "This girl don't hear, don't speak, ain't no good for nothing but labor. Who'll take her?" The men in the crowd spat and laughed, tossing coins for whiskey instead. Silas, staring at her pale face, felt a pull he could not explain. Maybe it was the way she stood, neither begging nor breaking. Maybe it was that same silence he wore like a second skin, mirrored in her stillness. With 3 silver coins he claimed her. No one else bid. The crowd jeered, "Fool rancher bought himself a broken doll." But Silas didn't care. He led her home. Her name was Emmeline. She never spoke, never answered questions. But Silas soon discovered she was not deaf, nor dumb, nor broken. She listened, not with her ears, but with something deeper. She would lift her face to the horizon minutes before storms rolled black across the plains, her eyes narrowing as if she heard thunder long before the clouds obeyed. She would rise in the night and lay a hand on a mare heavy with foal, whispering silence into the barn until the animal delivered safely. She would pause by a neighbor's fence and stare at a house before knocking, just in time to find a child fevering, lungs tight with sickness. Word spread. Some said she was witch-touched, that her silence carried omens. Mothers crossed themselves when she passed. Men kept their hands on their gun belts. But others began to see her gift as something rare, something holy. When cholera swept through the valley, it was Emmeline who guided the women to boil their water, to keep their children near. When a tornado cut a scar across the horizon, it was Emmeline who led the cattle to higher ground before the winds tore through. She never spoke, but the land and the people learned to listen. Silas found himself listening most of all. He watched her hands as they worked, graceful in their silence. He watched her eyes, how they softened with the children she tended, how they sharpened when danger stirred, that fever had stolen. But Emmeline taught him another kind of love, one without words. A love that was seen in the way she laid her hand on his chest after a long day, grounding him to the earth. A love that showed itself in the way she leaned her head against his shoulder, her silence full of everything he thought he'd lost. He realized then that listening was not about ears, but about presence, about being fully alive to another soul. Their bond was tested again and again. When bandits rode through and fires sparked across the plain, when neighbors whispered that she was cursed, Silas stood by her, his rifle steady, his eyes fierce. And Emmeline, who had been cast off as worthless, gave him back not just a ranch, but a reason to live. They never spoke vows in a church. Instead, their promises were written in the soil they tilled together. In the hearth they built stone by stone. In the nights they endured side by side. Years later, when children born of neighbors and kin would gather at their table, they would not remember that Emmeline had once been feared. They would remember the woman who could sense storms, who had saved lives, who had taught them that listening was more than sound. Silas would sit at the head of the table, his hair gone to silver, and watch her move through the room like firelight, quiet, steady, enduring. And in his heart, he would know the truth. Love does not always come roaring with words or blazing with thunder. Sometimes love arrives in silence, grows in silence, and endures forever in silence. The wind howled across the Wyoming Territory in late January of 1877, scouring the land with snow so fierce it buried fence posts and carved drifts high against the ranch houses that dared to endure it. But even in that pitiless storm, Silas Granger caught sight of something that would change his life forever. He had ridden out that morning with his coat pulled tight and his scarf frozen stiff against his beard, just meaning to check the north line where the cattle huddled against the windbreak. But instead he found her, a woman lashed to a fence post, her skirts torn, her hair caked with ice, and in her arms 3 newborn infants wrapped in nothing more than bloodied rags. Her face was blue with cold, her lips trembling on the edge of death. Yet when she lifted her eyes to meet his, before the wails of the infants filled the cabin with fragile, defiant life. Only then did she whisper her name, Maribel Quinn. And in that name was a shadow Silas already knew. For Joseph Quinn was a rancher of ill repute, a man whose deaths and whiskey had made enemies from Cheyenne to Deadwood. The truth bled out in broken words across that first night. Joseph had cursed her for birthing daughters instead of sons, had called her barren of worth, even as she cradled 3 perfect souls. And in his drunken rage had tied her to the post with the newborns, leaving her to freeze so he might be free of the burden. Silas, who had buried too many hopes of his own in the frozen earth, felt something raw and righteous blaze in him. He swore then, though only to himself, that Joseph Quinn would never again lay hand nor claim on this woman or her babes. The days that followed were a battle for survival. The blizzard raged on, rattling the windows and screaming down the chimney, but inside the cabin a fragile haven formed. Silas milked his 1 cow by lantern light, feeding the infants drop by drop, coaxing them into the world they had barely joined. Maribel, weak from blood loss and frostbite, watched him with hollow eyes that slowly filled again with something like trust. The girls, Eloise, Ruth, and June, as she whispered their names, were swaddled in old flannels, laid in a carved drawer by the fire, their cries a chorus of persistence. Nights stretched long, with Silas pacing the floorboards, cradling whichever child would not sleep, murmuring rough prayers he hadn't spoken since he was a boy. He had been alone too long, his house too empty, and though he told himself this was only duty, only kindness, The truth settled into his bones with every heartbeat of those girls, that he had been waiting for them without knowing it. But storms do not last forever, and when the skies cleared, danger rode on the horizon. Word carried that Joseph Quinn was searching, furious that his property had slipped away, and that he had men willing to enforce his claim. Silas sharpened his axe, cleaned his rifle, and made quiet visits to Sheriff Mather, a friend who understood both the law and the spaces between it. The townsfolk muttered, divided between those who and swore vengeance. But he rode away alone, and the law, such as it was in that wild territory, turned a blind eye, letting justice be written not on paper, but in the resolve of the community. The months that followed saw spring thaw the land and thaw the grief that had chained Silas's heart. Together he and Maribel built a life from the wreckage, naming the place the Hearth at Granger Ridge. The name was hers, for she said the hearth had saved her and the children, that warmth and fire were the truest forms of home. And so it became not just a ranch, but a refuge. Travelers found shelter there, widows found work, children found safety. Silas built a cradle of pine with his own hands, his rough fingers smoothing each joint, and Maribel sewed quilts that carried not just thread, but hope. Love between them did not come like lightning. It came like spring itself, slow, stubborn, breaking through frost with green shoots, until one morning Silas realized he could not remember the shape of his life without her. When he finally asked her to stay, truly stay, as his wife, she said yes, not with words, but with tears and a smile that carried all the weight of the storms they had survived. Years later, as Eloise, Ruth, and June grew into strong young women, with the same fire in their eyes their mother had shown that night in the storm, travelers passing through would pause at the sight of the ranch. They would see children laughing in the yard, smoke rising from a chimney, and a man and woman standing side by side at the gate, their hands clasped. They would see not just survival, but love chosen in the face of cruelty, love forged in the coldest winter and warmed by the fiercest hearth. And in the quiet of the evening, as snow fell soft and forgiving across Granger Ridge, Silas would whisper to himself that some storms are not meant to destroy, they are meant to deliver. The desert sun of New Mexico in 1879 burned merciless and bright, turning every shadow into a secret. And it was under that cruel light that Calder Wyatt first saw her. A girl hanging from a mesquite tree, a crude sign pinned to her chest that read in jagged letters, "White man don't forgive." Her skin was torn with welts, her lips cracked, her body sagging in the noose, but not yet claimed by death. Family's camp. Her mother's screams swallowed by smoke, her brothers cut down in the dust. Calder listened, each word striking a chord of guilt within him, for he too carried failure. A sister he could not save, a promise he had broken when violence came knocking years before. They were two souls scarred by fire, drawn together not by trust at first, but by survival. Ayanna's suspicion was a fortress, her silence a weapon sharper than any knife. She flinched at the sound of boots on the porch, at the jingle of spurs. But slowly, through the weeks of hiding and healing, she came to see that Calder's hands, rough as they were, did not mean harm. He showed her where the river bent cool and secret through the rocks, how to mend fences, how to move unseen when patrols passed. She showed him in turn how to listen to the land, how the wind could tell of riders before dust rose, how the cry of a hawk spoke of change. Nights by the fire, words gave way to silences that were not empty, but full. Silences where her eyes met his and spoke of grief shared, of lives bent by cruelty, yet unbroken. Trust grew slowly, like a sprig of green in desert stone, fragile but fierce. Danger never strayed far. Soldiers hunted for runaways, bounty men sniffed for coin, and neighbors whispered that Calder had taken in an enemy. One evening, fire lit the horizon, torches carried by vigilantes who came demanding justice. Calder stood with rifle in hand, Ayanna at his side, and the night turned sharp with gunfire. They drove the men back, but the cost was blood, and the warning was clear. they would not be left in peace. So they fled south, through arroyos and across salt flats, chasing whispers of land where they might not be hunted. Pursuit came swift, iron horses and rifles clattering in the distance. In one ambush, Calder was struck, a bullet tearing across his side. He fell, choking on dust, but Ayanna, who had once been cast aside as helpless, rose fierce. She dragged him from the field, stitched his wound with trembling hands, and stood guard through the night, her knife flashing at every shadow. In that crucible their bond hardened, not master and saved, not rancher and outcast, and with them came new life. Ayanna's belly swelled, carrying the promise of a child who would be born of both worlds, a bridge between grief and hope. Calder, scarred and weary, would lay his ear against her and listen to the heartbeat, a rhythm stronger than any rifle shot, more enduring than any hatred. Together they dreamed of raising that child by the river, teaching them not of vengeance but of forgiveness, not of fire but of love. And though the desert still held its cruelty, though the world beyond their river might never forgive, within their small haven they had written a new law, one born of survival, scarred by loss, yet redeemed by the courage to love. For some stories in the West were carved in blood and dust, but theirs, against all odds, was carved in water and in the promise of a life yet to come. Cinematic Western romance is not written in ink alone, but in dust rising from hooves, in the glow of lantern light against cabin walls, in the silence between two souls who dare to reach across a chasm carved by loss, war, or wilderness. And this style, like the land itself, is vast and unforgiving yet tender in its hidden valleys. It begins with the grit of the frontier, the scrape of boots on saloon floors, the howl of wind across empty ranges, the relentless press of hunger and drought. And yet within that backdrop blooms something delicate, the stubborn wildflower of love that survives where no one believes it can. Narration takes on the cadence of campfire smoke drifting upward, slow, measured, painting each moment with the intimacy of a whispered secret. Characters are never larger than life, but exactly life-sized, their hands cracked from work, their hearts scarred from betrayal or grief. Yet in those scars lies the shimmer of hope. The pacing is cinematic, pulling the audience like a rider through shifting landscapes. First wide shots of storms rolling across mesas, then close-ups of trembling fingers brushing against another's, of eyes lingering longer than words allow. In this style, violence is never spectacle but consequence, a shadow that lingers at the edge of every choice. When a gun is fired, it is not for thrills but because life demands sacrifice. When a storm breaks, it is not backdrop but mirror to the turmoil within the lovers who stand against it. And at the heart of every tale lies a paradox. Listener sitting close to the fire. Lean in, friend. Let me tell you what the history books forgot. Let me show you how love once bled on this soil and did not die. It thrives on contrast, the thunder of hooves and the hush of a touch, the cruelty of a noose and the salvation of a hand cutting the rope, the wide open sky and the intimate warmth of a single hearth. Every tale is crafted like a film, yet told like folklore, with scenes unfolding in the mind's eye. Snow swallowing cabins, rivers carrying fugitives south, wheat bending golden in winds heavy with promise. But beyond imagery, the true pulse of the style lies in emotion, raw, unvarnished, relentless. Love is not pretty but necessary, not fleeting but carved into the very marrow of survival. To write in this way is to honor both the land and the people who bled into it. To let every line taste of gunpowder and honey, every silence weigh as much as a spoken vow. And when the story closes, as the fire burns low, the listener should feel as though they have ridden miles beside the characters, their hearts heavy yet uplifted, knowing that in a world so merciless, love still dared to exist. That is cinematic Western romance. The marriage of grit and grace, of dust and devotion, a style built to be heard in the dark, where the West comes alive not only in the clash of outlaws and lawmen, but in the quiet defiance of two souls choosing each other against the world. Every Western romance worth telling begins with a hook sharp as barbed wire. a moment that seizes the heart before the dust even settles. Perhaps a rancher stumbling on a woman abandoned to the storm, or an outlaw lowering his weapon when he sees innocence shining back at him. And from that first heartbeat, the tale rides forward. Rescue is never clean, never simple. It is tangled in mistrust, in blood, in the weight of debts owed and secrets unspoken. Yet it is in that raw tension where the audience leans closer, wondering if these two souls can survive not just the land, but each other. Slowly, almost against their own will, trust begins to form. A fragile intimacy built in gestures rather than vows. A blanket shared by the fire, a wound stitched with trembling hands. A silence that carries more weight than words. But the West never lets love grow unchallenged. Weight and campfire warmth, reminding us that in the harshest land, love does not just survive, it endures.